Today's going to be a little bit of a different video. When it comes to the YouTube algorithm, it's a bit of a hit or a miss when it comes to what gets broadcasted outside of my existing audience and what kind of just, gets dead in the water. I haven't really figured it out entirely. I have a buddy who's kind of helping me out with that because he thinks that you can basically change a couple of settings and it'll reach a much wider audience. And so I'm kind of working with him to see how this is going to go, because why not? If it doesn't work out, who cares? If it does, great. The topic of today's video is understanding why the Communist Party in China will never lose power. And this is going to piss off a lot of Americans because this is a truth that they don't want to hear. And so I want to kind of explain the history and conditions of China that led up to why the 21st century is quite literally going to be the Chinese century, because of the arrogance of the American people. Not even the American people, the American establishment. Maybe the American people, it's hard to say. But we're going to wind back the clock to the 19th century when British travelers were reaching out to the Chinese and they were trying to once again facilitate trade with them. And trade between Europe and the East has always been a thing. You can talk about the Silk Road, which is something that existed in the medieval era, but it got blocked off from trading with the East, particularly China and India, because of the Ottoman Empire demanding high fees and taxes between the East and the West. And so this caused because of the Ottoman Empire, this caused the Western powers to begin exploring to the West. That's how they discovered the New World, is because originally Christopher Columbus was trying to find new trade routes into India and China, but going through the West rather than around the southern part of Africa, because they couldn't go through the Silk Road anymore. It just became not as lucrative because of the Ottoman Empire and their fees that they were trying to basically impose on the Western powers. So there was a bit of isolation that happened between the East and the West that, happened for a good brief period of time, that led into European colonialism. And so in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was first starting to kick off in the British Empire, and this was in the 19th century, this is about 150 years into it after the invention of the first steam engine, and a steam-powered water pump, should I say, is because that's how the steam engine started, by Thomas Savery, is that when the British first reached out to the Chinese again, the British originally tried to trade with the Chinese, these modern technologies that they had been inventing. But the thing is the Chinese were not even really aware of what the developments going on in Western Europe. And a lot of the Chinese were still expecting to trade and speak in Latin because they thought the Roman Empire was still alive in China. So, they were completely ignorant to the conditions of what was going on in the West, in the 19th century. Why, you might ask? Why did they think that the Europeans were still under the Roman Empire and they were still trying to speak Latin to the British? Well, because it goes down to something called Middle Kingdom syndrome that I would call it something that's developed in Chinese language more than it's developed in American language, right? But what is Middle Kingdom syndrome? Middle Kingdom syndrome is the syndrome where your civilization thinks it's the center of civilization itself. It thinks itself as the center of the world. It's almost a civilizational arrogance. And because it thinks it's the center of the world, it loses touch to the developments going on in the world outside of it. And for the Chinese, they were not aware of the developments going on in the British Empire of the last 150 years. They did not realize what was going on, such as the Industrial Revolution that would change humanity forever. Okay, because for the first time in human history, humanity had unlocked the power to perform mechanical work without having to use animal or human labor. It was scalable. It was a scalable, transportable ability to do mechanical work without having to use slaves or animals. And so this fundamentally changed not only the world, but started with the British Empire, is that you didn't need brute force slavery to do tremendous amounts of work anymore. This was getting quickly automated away because of the invention of the steam engine. But the Chinese were not aware of it. And there's a quote, and I'm going to quote to you, I think it was McKinley who basically reached out to the Chinese trading these sorts of things. What the Chinese emperor at the time told the British when he tried to trade with them, the various technologies that Europe had been developing, is because the Europeans were still trying to trade with them as equal trading partners like they had historically done, centuries ago. And the Chinese said this very stunning phrase, and I want you to take it to heart, is because I want you to look at the American arrogance that we have right now about the developments of the rest of the world. The Chinese told the British ambassadors, if you want to call that, the people who are exploring and trying to facilitate trade with the Chinese, I have no use for your fancy or ingenious train kits. I only trade in silver. Because silver was the currency of the Chinese Empire. It had been historically that way for 1,000 years. And the British realized these people are fucking stupid. And this began a series of one-way trade agreements that the Chinese call in their own language the Century of Humiliation, because they were unaware of the technological advancements that were going on in Europe They were humiliated in their own arrogance because they had completely fallen behind to the rest of the world that evolved around them. They were no longer the center of the world. They were no longer the Middle Kingdom because their arrogance and their victory had defeated them. Now, what does this have to do with the United States? It's one thing to call the United States arrogant, okay? And anybody can call that, okay? And honestly, I'm a bit of an elitist myself. I'm not against arrogance if you've earned it, okay? If you can show your way and show, like, what you're capable of doing and demonstrate that your superior is earned, okay, you know what, my hat's off to you. I bow to your superiority. Because I'm not somebody who scoffs at the idea of somebody inherently being better than me. If someone is genuinely better than me at chess, I'm not going to be angry and try and gaslight them that they're not better than me at chess. That's a code. So, you know, I will give due diligence to someone's skills if they've earned their arrogance. So when it comes to the American Empire, why do I say that this might be the century where the United States declines and copes? Okay, because there's really only two ways the United States is going to go over the course of the century, and neither one of them is exactly pretty. But we'll start off with that. Why is the United States arrogant and what makes it undeserved? First of all, I'll say right off the bat, the American Empire was the center of the world in the 20th century. It was the ideal standard of living in the 1950s. After World War II, the American century was the 20th century. You could probably look at the 19th century and the 18th century and not give much of a shit about America because, let's be honest, you know, that golden standard of living that the 20th century had, that boomers had flourished in, was not representative of the rest of American history, especially the 19th century with the Civil War, even the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era in the 1890s, which honestly we're probably closer to the 1890s than we are to the 1930s at this point. So that golden standard of living was a genuine thing. America has earned its arrogance because it was the center of civilization for the 20th century. Okay, but this is how victory defeats a civilization when it no longer reaches that. And for the Chinese, they were the center of a civilization for 1,000 years. You know, our country's existence, it's only 300 years old. It's not an old civilization. And so the arrogance that the United States has is different and possibly unearned, is because it doesn't understand its role within history. It doesn't understand what gave it its boost that made America as great as it used to be for that particular generation. And I'm not going to schmooze up and say the American Empire was all roses and whatever, right? We can talk about imperialism and, you know, go into endless discussions about that. I don't think anybody's going to cope about that in my comment section. But here's the thing. What is the arrogance that the United States has that does not match what it's producing? Okay, and it goes down to this. Okay, it goes down to power politics of brutality versus enfranchisement. And this is why the Communist Party of China is probably never going to lose power. After Maoist China came about in 1949, where they basically had liberated China from the colonial powers, and they had a unified China after with Mao's reign. Okay, Mao's not a leader because he caused a lot of problems, like in the later part of his life. But the thing is the Chinese people always adore him is because he liberated his country from the colonial powers. Okay, after the century humiliation done by the British Empire, the Chinese learned very quickly, and this is why I say, you know, you probably should pay attention to their ideological thought, is because it's much more materialistic thinking than a lot of people would give them credit for. It's not some capitalist post hoc rationalization of their civilization. They even recognize, the communists and Marxists in their party recognize, that China was in the unique position of being one of the least developed nations on the face of the earth in the 20th century, okay? And recognize they hadn't even had capitalism. In fact, Japanese imperialism and colonization of their country was to develop capitalism in their own country at the expense of the Chinese. And so here's the thing about what this is what it comes down to: power politics versus enfranchisement politics. The Chinese are acutely aware that their century of humiliation was brought about by an ignorance and an arrogance that led itself to technologically fall behind the rest of the world, particularly the Western power. And they felt that stung for 100 years. And it was not a fun sting. You can go look at the historical footage where the Chinese are kind of treated like slaves in a sort of sense. For about a century, they're high up on drugs. It wasn't a pretty thing. And, you know, on top of that, it's just like the racism from the Western European powers that they faced left a nasty taste in their mouth towards Western Europeans. You know, you can kind of see the same kind of sentiment in Vietnam as well because of the French. The Chinese are acutely aware of the conditions and the arrogance. They even title it Middle Kingdom Syndrome that led to their downfall and the century of humiliation. They know what it's like to feel the sting of falling behind because of arrogance. And so if you look at the policies of the Communist Party of China, especially under Xi Jinping, their policies are all about developing the productive forces because they don't ever want to be in a position again where they fall behind to the rest of the world, where they're consistently having to beg the more developed powers for assistance to be dependent on them. Look at the development. If you're going to give me this cope about that they haven't done much for their country, I want you to look at the developmental differences between China and India and tell me which one would you rather live in, okay? And if you would rather live in like the average Indian city as opposed to the average Chinese city, then I hate to tell you, you're a coper, dude. Like, you're just lying to yourself. And India has been far more friendly to American politics and the American state than China has, for the obvious reason that they're communist. They even did such a point in the 1970s under Indira Gandhi, if I can remember her name correctly, is that when the IMF threatened to withhold loans if they didn't sterilize a section of their population, you know, they actually went through with sterilizing 3 million some odd males in India. So let's not pretend that India is not some ally of the United States. In fact, it's sucking the dick of Israel probably the most. But that's neither here nor there. What they did, what the Chinese Communist Party realizes that the ruling class of the United States doesn't, is that they have to develop their country and their civilization to some degree or they will be ousted. Ever since the Tiananmen Square massacre and the instability that came from that, the Communist Party of China recognizes that if they don't bring prosperity to their civilization, an American color revolution is going to oust them out of power, you know, before they can even say, like, what the fuck? Let's put that into reality. Think about that. If they didn't bring prosperity to their civilization, they would have been ousted from power by a color revolution long ago. And these conditions, the conditions of external geopolitical forces, has almost been like an evolutionary pressure on the Communist Party in China to deliver a prosperous civilization, or they get ousted, they get killed. It's that simple. And so it's created this technocratic, highly meritocratic party that is focused on civilizational enrichment because they have to for their own survival. And on top of that, coupling it with the pairing that with the century of humiliation that the Chinese face, you know, they're hell-bent on advancing the productive forces as much as possible, just to not fall behind the Western powers ever again. They've created, the Communist Party is unironically a technocracy. They're a technocratic, highly meritocratic party that is focused on the advancement of their own civilization, the enrichment of their own civilization, regardless of political ideology. They are neither capitalists ideologically or they're communist ideologically. In fact, you know, they'll use capitalism insofar that it enriches their civilization. They'll use free market competition to make sure that the best product reaches the market. But they'll use socialism to keep larger corporations in line and just outright turn them into a state-owned enterprise. They have a hybrid economy. A lot of people would say that they are fascist. I don't agree with that notion because a lot of people who discuss political ideologies on what kind of mode of production a civilization or a country has is predicated on an ideological presupposition of forcing a system onto reality rather than recognizing it as a reflection of the existing forces of production at that point in history. You know, they're utilizing capitalism to develop their productive forces because they were a backward feudal empire that had very little productive forces in the first place. So they're utilizing a controlled form of capitalism to enrich their civilization. And so this is, I want to contrast the politics of the Communist Party of China is because there's a stereotype in the back of the head of every Westerner that China is some, you know, authoritarian hell state where you either do as you're told or you get shot. And this is entirely a projection, and I'll tell you why, okay? Because when it comes to the Communist Party of China, like I said earlier, if they didn't enfranchise or enrich their civilization to some degree, they would be ousted from power by an American-backed color revolution at the speed of light. They don't have a choice. And that's why they're a very technocratic, meritocratic party in the first place. And this is in contrast to American politics. Just look at the way American politicians treat their stuff. Look at the fact that the ruling class of the American country is so arrogant that they will shamelessly sell off our lands to foreign investors, and at the same time, under the current presidential administration, talk about deporting American citizens from their own homelands to foreign countries and foreign concentration camps. Our ruling class has become arrogant. Why? Because they think that they're beyond reproach and that they can get away with this indefinitely. That's the problem with the American ruling class. And I'm not saying this from a moral standpoint at this point, is because I realize, like, the propaganda of the ruling class is just so strong that, you know, it's almost kind of a pointless thing. I kind of see myself as a man sitting on YouTube as a single man speaking truth to power at this point, watching the destruction of his own country. And at this point, it's a matter of self-interest at this point. That's all it is. And so when I say these things, and I speak to the ruling class, because that's who I'm speaking to right now, is because when they rely on these stereotypes of China being this brutal authoritarian state where they just smack people around to get what they want, but they don't recognize that they have actively enriched their civilization over the last 30 or 40 years, this is going to be your downfall, and it's not going to be pretty. The American people are never going to forgive you for selling off their lands to foreign investors and then selling off their people to third world concentration camps. And so I want you to realize, okay, the critical difference as a single man speaking truth to power on a micro channel on YouTube, that while you bully around the American people, okay, it's only a matter of time before you hollow out this empire and you leave the American people with nothing, because you're too busy playing power politics to secure your existence like a petty tyrant over ordinary people through spying on back-ending people through various technologies such as their phones, you know, their cars. You know, that's why our trading partners of the American state don't even trust us anymore, like Germany, like the Lockheed Martin F-35, where they back-ended things to control our allies. You know, you think you can basically play the reins behind the scenes and offer nothing of tangible benefit to the people you exist with, your trading partners, because you see a one-way direction, because the United States is used to getting its way in many of its trading relationships to such a degree that it's become arrogant. It has Middle Kingdom syndrome, just like the Chinese did 200 years ago, because it's so used to using power politics to get its way that it can just wag its finger and use a show of force, and the world will just bow to its existence. A country that is only 300 years old, and it thinks the rest of the world will eternally bow to it. Okay? That is how arrogant and stupid it is. It thinks it'll eternally do this while it provides no tangible benefit to the people it's bullying around. Now, I said I'm not against elitism. I consider myself a bit of an elitist to some degree as well. But I also recognize, like I said in my, people will choose fascism over the cost of eggs, is that nobody will respect your authority or even let it last as long as you want it to last if you provide no tangible benefit to justify your authority and existence at the top of that hierarchy. And this is ultimately why the Communist Party in China will never lose power, no matter how much propaganda you spew, no matter how much you try to gaslight Chinese people about how the average American is worth 1.2 million. Bitch, I rent all my stuff because I'm too poor to afford an actual house, and I'd be living pretty house poor if I did try to get a mortgage on a house, okay? No amount of gaslighting is going to be able to change this fact, because you're so busy trying to play power politics with the American people, thinking you can beat people with a stick endlessly, and people will just fall in line. And if you don't have that stick anymore, you're in for a terrible reckoning. If you don't have that stick anymore, because as soon as you lose a slight grip of power, people will crucify you, and they will do it shamelessly, and they will celebrate your crucifixion. Not too long ago, just in December, a man popped Brian Thompson. Luigi Mangione popped Brian Thompson. I don't really care about the court details, is because I'm not even a relevant, person in that fucking trial. Okay, so don't fucking at me in my comment section being like, I'm innocent until proven guilty. That's not the point, okay? Somebody popped a CEO, and the American people celebrated it. And again, I sit here as a lone man on YouTube speaking truth to power, saying this fact is that if that stick ever disappears and an alternative power ever rises where you're no longer top dog, you're going to be in for a terrible reckoning if you don't wake up to the fact that power politics isn't a substitute for enfranchisement of your own base. Again, the Chinese would have never tolerated the Communist Party if they didn't enrich their civilization one bit. Okay? And I know this is going to make some of these people fuming mad, because they know deep down in their hearts that I'm telling the truth. They hate it. And so if the ruling class wants to be wise about how to handle this situation, it's going to stop trying to deport American citizens to foreign concentration camps. It is going to get rid of BlackRock. And it is going to do some social democratic reforms to give land that was originally the American people's back to the American people. There's no other way this is going to end. I'm expecting the Trump administration to go exactly the way I think it's going to go. Because, they might have rode the wave of populism into political power because people were upset about the cost of living crisis. But thus far, they have done nothing to address the cost of living crisis. They have not gone after BlackRock. They have not gone after these multinational asset firms that are buying up American properties and renting them out at extortionate rates. In fact, of going after the people who have basically stolen our lands and created the greatest land theft in American history since the COVID pandemic. They're talking about deporting American citizens who just disagree with the regime. And so again, I know this is going to piss off the ruling class. I don't care at this point. It's because I don't see a bright future for the United States either way. Honestly, I don't blame people who are just leaving this country. It's because this country's going down the shitter. Is because we have an arrogant ruling class that is just consistently trying to play power politics with the lives of the American people. Okay, I don't blame anybody who's going to just leave this country. They might not do it loudly because, you know, they don't want to be mocked by conservative dipshits. Telling them, like, if you don't like this country, just leave, okay? You know, I know that they're just going to quietly check out of the country. I've already heard it happening. It's already happening to some degree. But this is the future of the United States if nothing changes, okay? Either A, you know, the United States and its fascist chimp out is just going to destroy itself and cannibalize itself internally over the next 10 to 20 years. And so what's going to happen is that after it cannibalizes itself, it's going to be a hollow shell of its former self and it's going to balkanize. Or it's going to go over the course of the 21st century where the ruling class, because they're consistently coping about what the Chinese are doing in their own country, and they have to basically use their propaganda, because let's be honest, the propaganda apparatus in the United States sniffs its own farts. It sees China as this brutal authoritarian regime that shoots people in the back of the head if it disagrees with them one slight bit, okay? When in fact the United States does that, and they're already talking about deporting American citizens to El Salvador. It's entirely a projection. The United States very much makes projections of these foreign countries, and then whatever projection it has of these foreign countries of being these brutal, terrible things, it then does it to itself and acts like, well, you know, we're just nominally more humanistic than are these foreign countries that are just so evil and authoritarian. It does everything it claims these other countries do, because it owns American citizens, okay? And I don't think they're going to stop doing this. I think they're, in the arrogance of the ruling class, they're going to go through with doing this, and they're going to gleefully do this. And then what the rich are going to do is once they've hollowed out this country and then we're left with a broken and shattered nation, they're going to flee to another country. That's what they're going to do. They're going to leave us with a broken and shattered nation to pick up the pieces after they've hollowed us out. They've sold us all our lands off to foreign investors. They've deported, you know, dissidents to El Salvador concentration camps. And, you know, when everything's all over and done in this hollow feudal state, because let's be real here, we're paralleling a lot of the same similarities of the decaying Roman Empire. I don't see Trump as a Hitler figure. I see him as a Nero figure, an idiot. Okay, an idiot who has a big stick and he thinks he's going to get whatever way he wants because he's working with some of the richest men in the world. And if you think that I'm being hyperbolic when I'm comparing it to the Roman Empire, 36% of the volunteer firefighter force in California, you know, just earlier this year, are prisoners. They are victims of litigious slavery. And the reason I call it litigious slavery is because unlike the brutal slavery under the Roman Empire, there's always a litigious pretext on why these people deserve to be there, you know, through the legal system. That's why I call it litigious slavery. We are a litigious slave state, where under the pretext of the law and some made-up charge, we throw people in jail, and then we turn them into slaves for private corporations. Let's be real here. And so the United States is decaying much like the Roman Empire, but just through a more litigious slavery with corporations at the behest of our civilization that sell off our lands to foreign investors and sell off our people to third world concentration camps. And so the end of the United States might go out in a bang, and it might lead to a balkanization, is because I'm going to be honest with you, Trump looks like he's going to be leading the country into a civil war with the unrest that is going on. And the Democrats are too fucking stupid to do anything about it, because they would rather just sit on their asses pretending self-righteously that, you know, none of this would have happened if they just throw the ball of responsibility in the American people's court. None of this would have happened if they just got voted for. No, we have fascism, my Democratic friends, because you didn't want to address the cost of living and you wanted to gaslight them. You gaslit the American people over the sorts of stuff. You're not entitled to our vote. So that's where we're going. I'm not going to pretend it's going to go any better. And I say all of this in this entire YouTube video because I'm just a lone man with a micro audience speaking truth to power. Why? Because I know it angers you, because the truth fucking hurts. Have a nice day.